We're seeing now these first images of the people leaving the White House after these private meetings. That was just Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff and Usha Vance, J.D. Vance's wife. He's the incoming vice president, of course. And they are the first to be set up in the official limousines to be departing the White House, heading over to the U.S. Capitol for the swearing-in ceremony, which will be happening in just under 2 hours from now if we're sticking to the official schedule of events here in Washington. There you see one of 4 limousines now, at least, that are lined up there at the portico of the White House. We'll be taking Doug Emhoff and Usha Vance off to the U.S. Capitol. They are departing now. We expect next to see Vice President Kamala Harris and the incoming Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, exiting next and getting into their limousine to be taken off to the U.S. Capitol. Of course, J.D. Vance, here in just a little over an hour and a half from now, will be the Vice President of the United States, being sworn in by Supreme Court Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh, one of his longtime friends, as we're all reading up on history of all of the characters involved with this Inauguration Day. They've known each other since their Yale Law School days, so there's a fun fact for you. But here we're still looking at pictures of the White House where for the past little bit of time, under an hour, there's been an unofficial casual tea and coffee, off the record, at least not privy to reporters like me, but a meeting between President Joe Biden, First Lady Jill Biden, and the incoming President Donald Trump, President-elect, and Melania Trump, his wife. They have been gathering for one of these moments that we see on Inauguration days here at the White House. And soon, those two will also be getting into a car together and making that trip just a couple of miles down to the U.S. Capitol, where the rest of the official swearing in for Donald Trump's inauguration will be happening on this Monday, January 20th, here in Washington, D.C. So we're looking at those doors, waiting to see who is coming out next. Sagar, we can spend this moment, I guess, just to kind of talk a little bit about this last day in office for the Bidens, not just as an administration, but as a family. They have been living in the White House for 4 years. And once they leave here in just a few minutes, that move-out process really kicks in to do that turnover in between administrations. There's really only about 5 or 6 hours to get it all done. What all is going to be happening once they exit those doors?
Yeah, it is a fascinating choreography that takes place right now at the White House. We're looking at the North Portico. Well, they arrived and they'll be leaving. On the other side of the White House, there are moving trucks lined up that will be waved in the instant that the Bidens and the Trumps leave. One group will be moving all the Biden stuff out. One group will be moving all the Trump stuff in. In between, stripping all the beds, shampooing the carpets, replacing what needs to be replaced. Linens, towels, whatever it might be. Closets stocked. The White House usher's office would have been in touch with the Trumps for the last few months about where certain things go, what are the favorite foods and snacks that we need to have in the various kitchens, in the residence, and elsewhere. We know all about Donald Trump and his penchant for Diet Cokes. You can rest assured that there is a lot of Diet Coke on hand, at least on the White House driveway right now. So, yeah, they've got about 4 or 5 hours of controlled chaos, as one former White House official put it, to get all the old First Family stuff out and make sure that when the new First Family comes in, they're good to go. They're not having to root through boxes like the rest of us when we move into a new place and, you know, where is that stuff for the kitchen, or where did we put the bike pump, whatever it is. That's all laid out in the mansion. Donald Trump's not going to have to be looking for any of that.
Yeah, moving day is always a stressful time. Try not to think about that, because it's just, you're living in those boxes for months, but not when you're living in the White House, because there are plenty of folks to take care of that.
And then there's the personal part of just leaving where you've lived for 4 years, a place that in Joe Biden's case, he tried so hard for so long to get into, and now has to leave 4 years later. And on his, perhaps his final tweet under the @POTUS account on X, It's a selfie with the president and the first lady with a snow-covered rose garden behind them and the Oval Office just on the other side. One more selfie for the road. We love you, America. So you can almost picture them stepping out onto the colonnade on this horribly cold DC day to say, hey, let's take a quick selfie. I mean, I've done that, walking along that when we're out covering White House events. But for the president and first lady to get to do that one last time, because as you said, when those doors open again and they walk out, that's it. They're boarding what would be known as Marine One and heading out. And that is the end of the Biden presidency.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to think about, what you were just mentioning about that personal side of things. What we're watching are all of these official events, and what we know always is part of the TikTok of a day, like Inauguration Day. There are set pieces. There are even specific times assigned to a lot of this, especially that noontime when it is according to the way that things are set out. It's not just we picked this time. It's like that is the official time. Now we're seeing those doors at the north portico of the White House open again. We see First Lady Jill Biden and incoming First Lady Melania Trump exiting and getting into their own limousine, where they will be taken over to the U.S. Capitol. As we think about these situations, Sagar, we have talked a little bit about the outgoing president and the incoming president and kind of what they might share in casual conversation. But this is also a first lady who's been here before. Melania Trump has been in the White House and has occupied that role. And I wonder she's at the end of this next term, she will have been first lady for longer than Jill Biden was. She will have more experience, but I just wonder what their conversations are like too, in terms of what they hope to accomplish or what Melania is thinking about in this next 4 years.
And Melania recently told Fox that it's easier this time around. She's lived there. She knows what the space is like. She knows what they want. She knows which furniture they want to bring in. The incoming first family gets to redecorate the residence with things pulled from White House stocks and bring things from home that are sentimental or what have you. And she said, since we've been here, and I know what it looks like, we were kind of coming in blind last time, although Michelle Obama did invite her into the residence and gave her the tour 8 years ago. Again, a courtesy that Melania Trump did not extend Jill Biden 4 years ago. But she didn't need that this time. And in fact, she skipped Donald Trump's visit here after the election. She knew what it was about, and she knew what she was getting into, and she seemed visibly more comfortable in this interview with the prospect of, moving away from Trump Tower and moving away from these big gilded residences that they have in Florida and elsewhere, and moving into the White House. And taking pains to note that Barron Trump will have a bedroom in the White House for when he comes home to visit from college. He's not the little kid he was during the first Trump administration. He's now about, I think, taller than his father. Now it's a little bit jarring to see, frankly.
He has definitely grown up and attending colleges in New York City. Now we see Vice President Kamala Harris and incoming Vice President J.D. Vance making their exit. Let's listen in as they depart for the U.S. Capitol.
Thank you, sir.
So there's just one pair left in terms of who we anticipate to be departing the White House and heading to the U.S. Capitol. That will be President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump. who will be getting into what you see there, that limousine that's pulling up here at the north portico of the White House to take them to the U.S. Capitol for Donald Trump's second inauguration.
President Biden confirmed as President-elect Trump arrived this morning that he did in fact continue a tradition dating back to Ronald Reagan, now in 1989, of leaving his successor a handwritten note inside the Oval Office. There had been a little bit of question about whether that was going to happen. Donald Trump left Joe Biden a note. Remember, he did not concede the race, still has not conceded it, but he did leave Joe Biden a note. President Biden has refused to divulge what was in that, except he called it shockingly gracious. And Trump himself said that he spent a few days mulling over what to put in it. So President Biden's not saying what is in the note, but he is now the first president to receive a note from the person for whom he then had to write a note. We're full of presidential history and tidbits today, and that's
absolutely. It's just one of those circumstances.
That's another one that wasn't on the list for this morning, but there it is.
Thank you for that. I guess I'm just a nerd, but I do really enjoy learning more about this presidential history. And this is one of those days where we all kind of get good reminders of a lot of different inauguration-related tidbits, particularly. So much rich history here.
We would note that when the Trumps arrived, President Biden made it a point to say welcome home to Donald Trump as they approach. So I think the facial expressions will tell us something when they walk out those doors. A lot of smiles and handshakes on the way in, and now the reality of making that final walk out that door and that trip to Capitol Hill.
It is kind of interesting to think about this in the context of what we just saw a few weeks ago with former President Jimmy Carter's funeral, where we had the current president and several former presidents and their wives in attendance, seated together, greeting each other kind of backstage before they all came out. And there's always a lot of armchair quarterbacking in terms of trying to figure out exactly what the mechanics are and if any of these folks get along. But as we know, there is the ex-president's club, where only someone who has been through the mechanics of this job really understands other aspects of it. And I think that's something that's important to remember when we have these moments. There are a lot of political disagreements, certainly over a variety of different issues, but it is a select few people who really have been there and understand the gravity of the office.
And it's what America wants to put on display every 4 years, right? January 20th is the day to show the world, yes, this campaign was bitter. It was nasty. You and I were out there enough and heard these speeches. But when it comes time and the election happens, more often than not, the loser says, you know what, I lost. And the people made their choice. Now we move ahead. Now you make the change.
And here we see these doors opening again, where President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump are exiting the Capitol. They're preceded by Senator Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat from Minnesota. Let's listen in as they leave the White House. We're seeing Joe Biden and Donald Trump pulling away from the White House. Again, this is Joe Biden's last time exiting the White House as the President of the United States, and the last time that Donald Trump will make that same trip until he is president later on this afternoon. They're making their way over to the U.S. Capitol now, and as they make that relatively short trip, Sagar, I thought we could talk a little bit about some inauguration history. Clearly, America has been swearing presidents into office since 1789, but it hasn't always happened in Washington. Where was George Washington first sworn in?
Yeah,
where did that take place?
It didn't happen until 1801 here in Washington, because in 1789, New York City was the U.S. capital. So George Washington had to go all the way from Mount Vernon in Virginia, get all the way up to New York City in bad weather. And so the swearing in didn't happen until, well, it then used to be March 4th was the date. It didn't happen until April 30th. And so George Washington took the oath of office there. "I walk on untrodden ground" was one of the lines that he uttered. 4 years later, he took it in Philadelphia, which, again, at the time, was the capital. It wasn't until Thomas Jefferson that the first oath was taken here. It has been taken here every time since, whether that was in the Capitol, whether the oath was in the White House, like Ronald Reagan was forced to take it 40 years ago. You had the exceptions due to tragedy. You had Lyndon Johnson take the oath aboard Air Force One on the tarmac at Love Field in Dallas after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Calvin Coolidge, the vice president, was at his family farm in Vermont. No running water, no power. Warren Harding dies. A courier had to be sent to the Coolidge farm to tell the vice president that he was now the president. His father was a notary public.
Oh, convenient.
And standing in the family farmhouse with a kerosene lamp, gave his son the oath of office. Calvin Coolidge, of course, returned to Washington to then do that. But it's taken a few different forms over the years, but the oath stays the same. For now on, the date stays the same. And everything else is just kind of part of the fabric of Washington.
That's fascinating. We're seeing the motorcade now make that turn onto Pennsylvania Avenue as they proceed from the White House down to the U.S. Capitol. At the Capitol, we've seen various dignitaries making their way into the rotunda. We've had former speakers of the U.S. House and others who are getting into what is a relatively small space, all things considered, for an entire swearing-in ceremony to be happening. Ordinarily, we'd be out on the west front of the U.S. Capitol, but due to weather, everything is moved inside the Capitol Rotunda, where there are a number of seats arranged, but there's really only space for a small fraction of who would ordinarily be watching this all take place out of doors on the west front of the Capitol.
We've alluded to it so many times, but it's just so odd, having been in Washington for so long, to look at these streets, and there are basically police officers and a few tourists and what look to be perhaps some construction workers. That's it. I mean, we would ordinarily have tens of thousands of people lining this route to get a look at that. And we've been in a lot of motorcades. That's quite a motorcade, even for Washington. With that look, heading up toward the United States Capitol, decked out in flags, and you can see those flags lining the street to give you a sense of just how cold it is here in Washington. That's the wind whipping those flags.
And we saw the wind so intense there at the White House on the North Portico that I saw one of the flags kind of knock one of the Marines' caps backwards when they were holding the doors open for everyone. And it is extremely cold, but also blustery out there. So I'm glad you and I are inside.
Yeah, I think we've spent enough time outside for these events to appreciate being inside. But again, that's what has upended years of planning, and kind of sent the district into a bit of a tailspin, trying to figure out security and, again, the ticketing at Capital One Arena. 250,000 people had tickets to watch this happen from the Capitol grounds. That arena sits 20,000. The math is not very good.
No, and all those tickets now are considered to be commemorative tickets because they didn't get you access to the Capital One Arena if you had one of those Capitol tickets initially. And I'm sure there are a lot of disappointed people who had come to town hoping to get that viewpoint, but there is the event at Capital One Arena. I'm sure that there are a lot of places around Washington where folks have gathered to watch what is history. Regardless of party, it is still a historic moment to watch a new president taking the oath and it will look different. I mean, this hasn't happened from inside the rotunda in 40 years. So a lot of people who would have been paying attention to all the coverage today maybe weren't so much 40 years ago. So that it'll look different, but it's still part of history.
As we said, 600 people fit inside the rotunda. So, for example, the only former lawmakers that have been allowed inside, physically allowed inside the rotunda, are 3 former Republican House Speakers. Newt Gingrich is there, John Boehner is there, Kevin McCarthy, not a good Trump ally, but he is there. And the House came into session this morning, quickly recessed so that members could make their way over, but that traditional roster of so many folks is not going to be in place this time. Though we do know that a lot of these tech billionaires that Donald Trump has allied himself with, who have flocked to Washington, not just today, but in the weeks since the inauguration, have also scored some prime seating near where the president-elect will take his oath.
It's always important in these sorts of circumstances to look and see who is in there and then try to telegraph as much as we can what that signifies. And I think we already know in the incoming Trump administration the sort of relationships that he has been working to build with some of those that we're going to be seeing in there. The motorcade is now going to be approaching the U.S. Capitol, where we will see all the people who just loaded up at the White House, then arriving at the Capitol for, in about an hour, we will be seeing that swearing in take place for Donald Trump. Again, there on your screen, you see the U.S. helicopter. It would be Marine One when a president is on board, but otherwise, that is what Joe Biden will be boarding after Donald Trump is inaugurated. That is what will take then the former president and former first lady off to Joint Base Andrews, where they will begin a trip out to California, purportedly a vacation, an opportunity to kind of reset after their time in the White House has concluded. But for the next hour and change, Joe Biden will still be president, and he will be arriving here at the U.S. Capitol with the incoming president, President-elect Donald Trump, who has been part of this motorcade for the last couple of minutes, coming from the White House. Down there is that shot you see of Pennsylvania Avenue leading up to the U.S. Capitol. Not outside, but inside. He will soon be inaugurated for his second term in office. Here we see some of those shots of the motorcade as they make their way up to the area where all of the parties will be getting out of their limousines and walking into the Capitol.
Awaiting them in the rotunda already, you have Congress's top officials. You have House Speaker Mike Johnson, a Republican, who has very closely allied himself with the incoming president, saying to him, it's bright, sunny outside and bright in our heart. Then you have the Senate's top Democrat, Chuck Schumer, who walked in carrying a royal blue cap, and when asked how he feels today, said, feel great about the Bills. Now, that comes after the Buffalo Bills. Schumer, of course, from New York, beat the Baltimore Ravens last night to advance to the AFC Championship. So it was a way for Chuck Schumer to get in a plug for a home state team on the day after a big NFL playoff weekend.
We see these arrivals starting to happen there at the U.S. Capitol. We understand there were some other officials there in the motorcade with the president and president-elect as they were making their way into the U.S. Capitol. Amy Klobuchar, the senator, as we just referenced earlier, but also some other elected officials, including Deb Fischer of Nebraska, And then also House lawmakers, Steve Scalise, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, and other White House staff and officials accompanying the President, First Lady, incoming President and First Lady, and then of course Vice President Kamala Harris, her husband, and J.D. Vance and his wife. We just saw J.D. Vance and Usha Vance exiting their limousine, walking into the White House, or to the U.S. Capitol.
We see even police officers who are used to this kind of thing in Washington want to get their picture taken in front of the helicopter. That's quite a shot for that officer to have. Marine One sitting in front of the Capitol dome.
Not something you see all the time.
No. And you would note the flags. That one flag you can see flying in front of the Capitol dome back up at full staff after they had been lowered for the Jimmy Carter warning.
We see now people from that motorcade have been making their way into the Capitol. That includes President-elect Donald Trump. We're looking now inside the Capitol Rotunda. There you see Elon Musk, one of those businessmen who are invited to be part of this very small, relatively speaking, swearing-in ceremony. There's Melania Trump. Second gentleman, Doug Emhoff.
Good morning, Mr. Vice President. How do you feel?
There's J.D. Vance and his wife, Usha. And we talked about this Capitol Rotunda really not having a lot of extra space, Sagar, for even those former lawmakers that we would usually anticipate being there for an event like this. But when we see these images and really just kind of note how close together everyone is, there is just not extra room to get maybe even one or two more people aside from what they've been able to plan for. It's a different kind of situation, but
Shoulder to shoulder.
yeah,
and you
pretty
can
much.
see in the front in that shot the current members of the Senate kind of crammed together. You had Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, next to John Barrasso, a Republican from Wyoming, who was next to Dick Durbin, the number 2 Senate Democrat from Illinois, all kind of clustered very close together here. Talked earlier about Brett Kavanaugh being the one who will administer the oath to J.D. Vance. Vance is only 40. Be not the youngest vice president, but one of them. There was a 36-year-old vice president, but that was back in James Buchanan's administration in the late 50s. But there have been others in their 40s, Al Gore, Teddy Roosevelt, but breaking with a bit of precedent here. A fairly young J.D. Vance set to take the oath of office, followed, of course, by the oldest man to take the oath as president in Donald Trump.
We're seeing now some members of the incoming Trump administration walking into the rotunda. Clearly, those confirmation hearings for a number of positions have been ongoing in the Senate for At least a week, a little over, and we anticipate those to resume again tomorrow. There have not been official votes, but there will be some more open hearings as well as some business meetings and markups of some of the committee work before a lot of those nominations proceed to the full Senate for their vote.
You had Kevin Hassett, who is looking to come back as the Trump White House's top economist after serving in that role in the first Trump administration. Tulsi Gabbard, who would be the national intelligence chief, Pam Bondi, Doug Burgum, all lined up there to watch the man they hope is their boss to be taking the oath.
Susie Wiles, White House Chief of Staff.
It used to be fun at these outdoor events on the West Front to look around it again. You'd see the justices of the Supreme Court sitting together. You'd see the Joint Chiefs, the nation's top military officers, sitting together and taking a look out at the crowd. In fact, we just got a look at General C.Q. Brown, who is the now outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's top military officer. Former Vice President Dan Quayle and Marilyn Quayle making their way inside the rotunda. We don't get a lot of Dan Quayle sightings in Washington lately, but that's now 2 in 2 weeks after he was here for Jimmy Carter's funeral.
Indeed.
We talk about young vice presidents like J.D. Vance. Dan Quayle, basically an unknown congressman when George H.W. Bush tapped him to be vice president in 1989.
It is rare to get all of these officials together in the same space, but I think there have been a lot of remarks lately about how that does happen at inaugurations and funerals, and we have had 2 of those in close proximity here in Washington in recent weeks.
It is reassuring, frankly, is it, for those of us who spend so much time covering the division here in Washington at the Ranker, to see these people sit next to each other, to chat with them, to do what George W. Bush did at the Carter funeral and literally tap Barack Obama on the belly as he walked by.
Former Vice President Mike Pence coming in. Clearly he was vice president in Trump's first administration. Now joining the dignitaries who are in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda.
To see a lot of Elon Musk today. He will be speaking at the parade of sorts inside Capital One Arena later today. Has been almost a constant by the president-elect's side since the last time you and I were in this room in November for the election.
And up until then, he had stumped so heavily for Trump on the campaign trail, particularly in Pennsylvania, which was one of those major areas of focus. But yes, was part of the events at Capital One Arena last night with his son X, who actually joined him on stage with Donald Trump and didn't make his own remarks, but certainly was part of his father's remarks. But now we see Musk there again in the Capitol Rotunda and will be the incoming head of the Department of Government Efficiency, not an official government agency, but intended to cut costs throughout the government, something that Donald Trump has asked Elon Musk to be in charge of. So we will see what that agency or what that department accomplishes.
A new agency to cut back on the other agencies. With Vivek Ramaswamy, who we saw earlier, he's there somewhere. There's nowhere really to hide in the rotunda. There's only
No,
so
we'll
much
see
room.
him. We'll see him pop back up. Not a lot of space.
It looks a lot bigger when you're in there and there aren't 600 people.
It does. There's Robert F. Kennedy Jr., again appointed by Trump to head the Department of Health and Human Services, yet to have a hearing on Capitol Hill, although that is anticipated to be among some of the more contentious confirmation hearings that could be happening for this administration.
Now, the other side of that shot, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State designate, who did testify last week, and another tech titan, Jeff Bezos. We talked earlier about what's in the Constitution about the inauguration. There's nothing about a parade, there's nothing about balls, there's nothing about how you get to and from the Capitol. It's the date and it's the oath. That's it. Everything else has kind of evolved organically. In this case, evolved due to the weather. But all it prescribes is that by noon, that oath has to be taken. We are just over an hour away from that, and should be approximately 55 minutes, let's say, from Donald Trump reciting those 35 words for a second time.
Former President Bill Clinton and former First Lady and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton coming into the rotunda.
Hillary Clinton said watching Donald Trump take the oath 8 years ago after he beat her in that election was one of the hardest days of her life, but she felt a duty to be there and again to be here today with her husband, the former president.
Former President George W. Bush and First Lady Laura Bush.
We lamented that the indoors are going to rob us of one of the great visuals from inaugurations past. George W. Bush sitting there in his
clear poncho.
Yeah, almost looked to be a homemade rain cover of sorts.
Yeah, with this being inside, we really don't get to see that winter weather gear, unfortunately. There's former President Barack Obama also coming in. Without former First Lady Michelle Obama, who notably said that she would not be attending this inauguration. Also did not attend Jimmy Carter's funeral here in Washington a few weeks ago.
Obama's office did not say why the former First Lady would not be here today. They did say she had a prior engagement during the Carter funeral, but again, pointedly, did not offer a reason for her absence today.
We're still taking a look inside the Capitol Rotunda there on the left-hand side, but on the right, that is again the Capital One Arena, where Donald Trump, after he is inaugurated, will be making his way in what would be the inaugural parade, is now subbed in for an indoor event there at Capital One Arena here in Washington. People have been gathering there for hours, and they will be still waiting for some hours before the new president arrives, but these are a lot of his strong supporters, and assuredly they will still be there by the time he shows up.
And as they watched the images from the rotunda on the big screen inside the arena, some boos as Mike Pence walked in, and then a lot more boos as Bill and Hillary Clinton were shown on there.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, please take your seats.
Folks in the Capital One Arena are able to watch all of the ceremonies and events from the Capitol Rotunda on the Jumbotron screen there in the middle of the arena.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, please be seated.
Here we see Supreme Court justices making their way into the Capitol Rotunda. Clearly, two of them will play a direct part of the proceedings here of the official swearing in. Chief Justice John Roberts will be the one to administer the oath to the president, as is tradition. And then Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh will administer the oath to incoming Vice President-elect J.D. Vance.
Interesting to note his wife's ties to both. You had Usha Vance served as a clerk for Chief Justice Roberts. That is a coveted post in the legal community. And J.D. Vance was once a student in a law seminar taught at Yale by Justice Kavanaugh. And that explains the ties there and the reason that you just saw Brett Kavanaugh walking in ahead of Clarence Thomas, who is the senior member of the court who always asks the first questions during oral arguments before the Chief Justice does. It is always Justice Thomas. And that was a little bit striking to see Justice Kavanaugh, who came to the bench years after Justice Thomas, walking in front of him.
Here you see members of Donald Trump's family making their way into the rotunda.
joked about burying Trump.